Hey guys, this is a tutorial to show you how to work with Photoshop from Lightroom. Now, Lightroom is fantastic. It pretty much does everything you need to do to an image at a basic level. The problem with Lightroom is that I think that the skin retouching is only very basic, so you're limited to how much you can do to skin in Lightroom. And also, if you ever want to do any complicated cloning or removing people from an image or advanced stuff like that, that's where Lightroom has its limitations. So that's when you're going to need to start working with Photoshop. And as your photography gets better and you want to have develop what you do to an image in a more advanced way, then Photoshop is far superior. But as a beginner, I recommend that you do as much as you can to your image in Lightroom. Get it to the point where you're happy with it, and then if you've got any further skin retouching that you need to do, or you need to remove a light or someone from the background, then you want to take it into Photoshop. So I've got my image open here and I follow my process. And if you're a beginner to Lightroom, you might want to check out my tutorials on organizing your Lightroom files and setting up your Lightroom catalog. There's about 5 tutorials that I've done that start you out in Lightroom from the start, so check those out. So first thing I want to do is just do a white balance. So I'm going to find a neutral area, and I think I'm going to use the road here, which is a mid-gray. So I can click on that, and that's going to give me a good light balance. If I don't like that, then I can find another area and I kind of click around. I think that's looking pretty good there in terms of white balance. So we've got the original shot looks a little bit cool, so I've just warmed that up a fraction and I'm happy with that. The next thing I want to do is make sure I've got a good black, so I'm holding down the Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, clicking down on the black slider, and I go across to the left until I get about that much black showing up in my image. All right, so let's have a look. We've got before and after. Happy with that. I'll do the same with the whites, but I'm going across to the right and I can see that I do have a good white. In fact, the sky is blown out. So the other thing I can do is maybe just tweak the highlights. Now, if I go for this image, I have exposed for skin tone. I think this was just as the sun's rising, so it's very early morning. So I'm not going to rescue that sky, but I can bring in a little bit more detail in the highlights there just by moving that slider across to the left there. About there I'm happy with, and I might just give the image a little bit of a tweak overall in exposure, and probably I'm just going to bring in a bit more of a black, and then as a last resort I'm going to give it a bit more contrast so we can see we've got before and after. So I'm happy with that, and I might just knock the color back a little bit to there. All right, so once I'm happy with that, I'm going to take this image into Photoshop and show you how Photoshop works. And what I'm going to work on is I'm just going to do a little bit of skin retouching under her eyes here and just remove a few of the blemishes there. So if I click on my image, right click on my image and go down to Edit in Photoshop, it's going to now open that image in Photoshop for me. And then, so we'll do that now, and it'll automatically open up Photoshop, and we'll see that the image now appears, and there it is. So here is my image straight out of Lightroom, opened up into Photoshop. Now, if your interface looks a little bit different to mine, if you just click down on Window and click onto Workspace, go down and make sure that you've got photography clicked as your workspace, and then you'll see that your workspace is going to look the same as mine, and that's going to make life a lot easier. All right, so just make sure we've got the workspaces selected. All right, so I've got my image opened up here. Let me just show you a couple of the panels. I'm not going to show you everything because I think with Photoshop, learn on a need-to-know basis. You don't need to know what every tool does. Just learn a couple and work with those. When you feel like you've mastered those tools, then as you get better and your skills improve, you might want to add a few more tricks to your bag of tricks. It's very similar to photography. You started out working with daylight, and then maybe after you work with daylight, you might start with a reflector, and then you're working with flash, and then you're changing modifiers. So it's a similar thing. Work on a need to know basis. All right, so from a beginner level, I'm just going to show you a few of the tools you need to know to get started with Photoshop. So the first one here, you've got your toolbar, and again, if it doesn't show up, you go into Windows and scroll down and make sure tools are clicked. Okay, and so you can see here the toolbar. If I'm using a tool and you can't see it, just follow what I'm doing, and you can actually, Photoshop will give you little demos when you load it, and it'll show you how to use each tool, and it'll tell you what each tool does. So that's very handy. But basically, to start out with, at this beginner level, I think one of the important ones to know is the zoom, and I can zoom in using my mouse. So if you've got a little scroller wheel in your mouse, you can set it and you can use that. I've actually got the Magic Mouse with the Mac, and I can just use my finger there to scroll in and out. Or if you don't have that, then you just click on the zoom tool, and just clicking there, it'll come up and down. If you want to zoom back, it's just a matter of holding down the Option key on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and you can zoom back. So what you want to do is just sort of have a play around and get comfortable with learning that zoom in and out tool. The other tool that comes in handy that I use a lot in Photoshop, especially at this beginner level, is the clone stamp and also the spot healing brush. Now these are both, they're very similar to the way you use the clone stamp and the spot healing brush in Lightroom. So if I want to do some cloning on this face here, let's just say, let me just get rid of the extras. All right, so let's just say I wanted to get rid of some spots here on the skin. You can clone directly onto your original file. All right, so I can get my clone tool the size of a spot, just like you would in Lightroom, and I can hold down the Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC on a piece of skin that is similar in color but clean in texture. Next to the spot, click on that, and I've chosen my patch of skin, and then I can just go ahead and clone over that. All right, now a couple of things when you do that is everything that I'm now doing to my image is destructive, which means that I am working on my original file and it's very hard to go back. You've got in your palette here, along with layers, channels, action, property, history, and adjustment. If you don't see any of these that I have, again, go to your Windows And I think the ones that you need as a beginner the most are the layers palette and also the history palette, and you might need the adjustments. So make sure that you've got those checked, and you will see them here in this little window. So if I click down on my history here, and you can see everything that I do to this image is saved as a history state. Now, you'll see this in the left-hand panel in Lightroom. The exact same thing happens. This time in Photoshop, you're going to see it come up in the panel here. Now, one thing that you might want to do before you start is in your Photoshop preferences, you can scroll down to Performance. So you go Photoshop, Preferences, Performance, click on that, and come over here, you'll see History State. And you can change that to as little as 1, or you want to maybe, I think as a learner, you should probably up that a little bit. I've got it set to 85. You might want to go to 100 just in case you're doing making lots and lots of changes to your image. Then you can keep track of what you're doing, and this is a bit of a lifesaver. So I would make sure that the amount is set a little bit high if you have it set low as a default. So do that, and then you can always, when you've done something to an image, you can go back to where you started, and you don't lose as much of your work. All right, so that's that. Now, when I'm doing anything to an image in Photoshop, what I like to do is not work on the original file. I like to duplicate the background. So that just gives me a buffer against making mistakes. So when I've opened my image from Lightroom, what I like to do is create a duplicate of that image. And the way you do that is you can right click on the image and you can hit duplicate layer, and then you duplicate the background copy and press OK. And so now I have a copy of the original file, and that's just basically as a safety. The shortcut to do the same thing, I'll just get rid of that, is to hit Command J, and that does the same thing. So you've got a copy of your background. Whenever I'm doing any skin retouching, so this is a pretty basic retouch, there's not a lot of detail, and Mimi here has quite lovely skin. So there is only like a couple of little blemishes. A really basic way to retouch this is to just use the clone tool. So again, I can do it directly onto this layer, but there is a better way. And the way I like to organize my skin retouching is to add a new empty layer. Now, this at first, when you're hearing all of this, again, it's like learning photography for the first time. It's a lot of new stuff to learn. It can be overwhelming at first, but it's like repeating it's the same process every time. So I promise once you've done a few, this actually gets easier. So first of all, I duplicate my layer. The next thing I do is I add a new empty layer over the top of that. And so it's like adding a little bit of tracing paper over the top of an image. Imagine if you were working with a print. You've got your original print. We've made a copy for safety, and we're working on our copy, not our original. And then to retouch that image, what we're doing is we're putting a new layer on top of that, and it's like we're applying a new empty layer of tracing paper. And to do that, it's this little icon here. It looks like a piece of paper. So if I click on that, I've now got a new empty layer, and I'll just show you how that works. I'll just turn on the pencil tool and give it a color. Okay, I can now draw all over that image, okay, and it's only the only thing that's appearing is on that empty layer. All right, so I'm applying all my retouching onto that empty layer, and it's not affecting my original layer. And this is a great way to retouch because you're applying everything onto an empty layer, and the bonus of that is Photoshop gives you the option to change the opacity. So let's say I've made the adjustments that I want to do. I can reduce the amount of that adjustment by reducing the opacity. All right, now there are other blend modes. We won't worry about them for now. The basic one that you need to know about is adding the empty layer and knowing that you can change the opacity of that adjustment just by changing this slider here. All right, so now that we know how that works, I'm going to get rid of that and add a new empty layer. All right, so I've got my new empty layer on top. It's like I've added a little piece of tracing paper, and now I'm going to go ahead and clone out some of these spots here. Now the trick is what Photoshop does when you're cloning is you're sampling an area of good skin, and it's like you're doing skin grafts basically. That's how the clone stamp works. So I'm taking a little skin graft from this area here, just above her lip that doesn't have any blemishes, and I'm cutting it out and I'm placing that little skin graft over this little bump here. That's basically what the clone stamp does. Now, the way this happens is Photoshop actually gives you different blending modes to do your skin graft or your clone. So once I've got my clone stamp selected, the tool here, up on the top here, you've got your options panel. I can change the size of my brush in pixels. So if I go up to quite large, you can see that it's quite large, and I can reduce it using that slider. I can also reduce or increase the size of my brush using the bracket key. And so using the bracket key, right bracket makes the brush bigger, left bracket makes the brush smaller. So that's a really handy shortcut to get to know. But until you're comfortable with that, again, when you're starting, it's a bit overwhelming. You might want to just use this slider here, and you can increase or decrease the size of your brush. The other thing you want to know when working with brushes is you want to match the hardness of your brush with the area that you're retouching, and I will show you what I mean now with that. All right, so I have my brush tool selected. There it is there. Okay, I'm going to come up here to the dialog box, and I'm going to click on that, and you'll get a drop down menu. Now I've chosen my size, and remember I can use my bracket key to increase or decrease the size of the brush. I can also change how hard or soft my brush is, and this is really important when you're doing more intermediate to advanced retouching. You want the hardness of your brush to match the type of area that you're trying to retouch. So generally what I find when I'm retouching skin, I want to use a soft brush because I want what I do to the image, the cloning or the skin graft that I'm doing, I want it to blend in nicely. So you want the edges to feather out. If I've got a hard edge, it's not going to blend as well. And I'll just show you here on this white background here. So at the moment, I've got my image, my brush set to 0 hardness, and you can see that as I click down on the brush, you can see that the brush is quite soft. There's a little dot in the middle there, and then it feathers out. And so that is a nice way to have your brush set for retouching, because it's like basically you're kind of airbrushing your skin grafts, and it's a very soft and it'll blend in. And the secret to good retouching is to make sure that it's not detectable. You don't want to see a hard edge. So if I was to now increase my hardness of my brush to say 50% and had another go there, you can see that the edge is far more prominent. It's still soft because it's 50% softness, but you can see that the feather is a lot less. And if I increase my hardness to 100%, you'll see that I get a hard edge on my images. The other settings with the brush tool are opacity and flow. Now, the opacity is the amount of ink or tone that you're applying to your image in one pass. So if I have my opacity set to 100% and I've got my hard brush, you can see that it'll apply it all in one go. All right, now if I reduce my opacity by, say, to 40%, you can see that it won't go anymore. Like, no matter how many times I go over that area, it's only going to apply that adjustment or that amount of tone or that amount of ink in one go. So you can control how much you're adjusting your images. So it is a good idea to work with opacity and flow to control the retouching that you're doing. So when you're doing your skin graft using the clone tool, you can control the amount or the thickness that you're applying your retouching and make it a lot more subtle. Now, if I drop my opacity down to 10% and I go over that area, I can go back, forth. It's never going to change. It's always going to remain at that 10%. If I lift and let go of my mouse and go over it again, I can build up that tone. So if I'm holding down the mouse or my pen tool and I keep going over that area, the opacity will never change. It'll always be at whatever I set it. If I unclick and click again, it's going to apply that amount of opacity over the top. And if I unclick and click again, I can build up the color that way. Now, the flow adjustment works slightly different. So imagine flow works a lot more in the same way as a pen on a piece of paper might work. So imagine if I've got a pen and so I've got my flow at 10%. If I was to go over this area and then go back and keep going, it's going to build up that tone to up until the point of 100% flow, as long as I keep going over that area. So if I want to just have a low amount of ink on my paper or tone on my image, I keep my flow low. The more I go over that area, the more ink or tone, it applies to that area. So keeping the flow down is and the opacity high is a really good way of controlling your retouching, because it means if you want to increase the amount of tone or ink or pixels you're placing over an area, you can control that by just continuing to go over that area. So having shown you that, that is why when I'm retouching, the ideal settings for skin retouching is to have the brush set to 0 hardness. The size will be whatever size you need to cover the blemish or area that you want to cover. Set the opacity to 100% and set the flow to somewhere between 5 and 10%. I find at the start, I think 10% is a good way to start as a learner. So you can just see that now when I'm applying the brush to the image, you can see that the adjustments are light and they're incremental. So if I want to go increase it, I just stay on the same area and keep adding that adjustment, and it'll build up gradually. So that way, when you're retouching images, you get a nice smooth transition and you build up your retouching nicely that way. All right, so now that we understand the difference between flow and opacity and know how to change the softness or hardness of the brush, we can do a little bit of basic cloning on this image. So remember, I'm going to put that empty layer or piece of tracing paper on top of my image. So I'm going to come down to this little icon here, create a new empty layer. So now I've got my protective layer of trace paper over my image, and I'm going to now clone over the top of my image. So I'm going to select my clone tool, and I've got a brush that I'm going to work with to retouch, making sure that my hardness is set to 0. I'll start with my mode. Just keep your mode on normal, so don't change that. Have your opacity at 100% and flow at 10%. As you guys progress down the track and continue to please watch the CCs and any tutorials that I'm doing, you're going to find that you'll hear me repeating the same steps, and then you'll hear that I'm actually stepping up and introducing different techniques. So add them to your bag of tricks as you get comfortable with each one. But for now, for this basic introduction to skin retouching, and when I say basic, I actually retouched my photos for many years using this technique, and these images ended up on covers, posters, albums, everywhere. So it's a perfectly good way of retouching. There are more advanced ways, but like as I said, you got to learn to peel potatoes first before we make the filet mignon. All right, so I've got my empty layer selected. I have my clone stamp selected. My opacity, my hardness is set to 0, mode normal, opacity 100%, flow is 10%, and okay, this one you need to remember. So there is an option, a little drop down option, sample. You want to click sample all layers. So make sure you've got that checked. And the reason we have that checked is when we're sampling, if I don't have that layer checked and I just have current layer, I've got nothing to sample. So when I try and sample, Photoshop is just sampling that top piece of trace paper. It's not getting any skin. You can't get that skin graft. There are no pixels to sample. So we need to make sure that we're telling Photoshop, I want you to sample from this layer and place it on top of this layer. So for now, just have it set at all layers. All right, I'm going to, using my bracket tool, make my sample area smaller, and I'm now going to find an area of skin that is clean right next to that blemish there. I'm going to hit the Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC. I'm selecting my area, my little skin graft, and I'm going to move it over and just brush it over that area. All right, and then I can do the same with this little blemish. And again, this is a very basic way of retouching. And if you've only got a few blemishes and a few little things that you want to do, this works quite well. If you've got large areas and the skin looks a lot more blemished and you're doing larger, coarser areas, I wouldn't recommend this. But I just wanted to show you that's like we've gotten rid of a few blemishes that way, and it works quite well. It also works for areas like this where you want to maybe just reduce the appearance of any dark circles under the eye. So again, I'm going to hit the Option key on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and I'm just brushing over that area. And so basically it's a skin graft from this area over to this area. Now this is something that you're going to do, you'll botch it, you'll want to redo it. That's why I've recommended that you keep your history state to like 100, so that if you don't like what you've just done, you can go back to where you started. Another good little safety tip with the history state is when you've got to a point where you're happy, if you're doing a big retouch, is make a new snapshot. And what that does is I've now got a snap or a saved history of everything I've done up until this moment. And you can now go back to that point in time if you need to catch up. So I want to make a new snapshot from here. All right, there it is. So I can save that, and I can easily, rather than having to go back to a certain spot, I just protect myself by creating those. So that's a really good way of protecting yourself when you're in these early stages. As you progress, there are better ways to control the retouching using layers and layer masks, but again, peeling potatoes at this point, so we'll go slowly. All right, so I've got that, and I've just gone over those blemishes, and I've just cleaned up under the eye. All right. Now what I can do with the adjustment that I've just done, so it's all on that little layer, empty layer on top of the image, or my piece of trace paper that's over the top of my photo, I can now reduce the opacity to around, somewhere between 50 and 60%, and suddenly it makes the whole transition a lot more subtle, and it blends in a lot more flawlessly. So if you look at an image and it looks retouched, you've gone too far. So it's just a matter of finding that little sweet spot where it blends in nicely. So that is a good way to do this sort of retouching at a sort of like just for little blemishes and things like that. Now you can also, with these little blemishes, using this empty layer technique, you can use the spot healing brush. So basically, and again, you want to make sure that you've got your hardness set to 0, and that you have the blend mode set to content aware. And so basically what that does, the healing brush, when you click on a spot, Photoshop says, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to take all those pixels and blend them in with all the pixels around them. So it's going to take these pixels in here and blend them in to make them look like the surrounding pixels. So hopefully if I click on that, it's going to do an okay job at getting rid of those little spots. I personally don't love the healing brush. I'm not a big fan of it. So, but if you're used to it and you like to retouch in that way, then you know, do it. I prefer using the clone stamp and just sort of lightly brushing over areas. And this will be a technique that as your retouching improves, you will still use this technique for some of your retouching. So that's now I'll show you what we've done. So we've got before and after, and we've gotten rid of some of the blemishes there. The other thing I like to do, and sometimes as a safety, I just might think, all right, I'm going to do a new technique. I'm going to add a new empty layer over the top of that and try something different. Another thing that I like to do with skin retouching at this basic level is use the brush tool. And what I do is brush over the top of the skin, and it's kind of like applying makeup. You're covering up the blemishes with a tone that is exactly the same as the skin tone. And the way I do that is I will find a nice area of skin and I'll hold down the Option or Alt, Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and do a click. And you can see that the eyedropper appears when I do that. Click on that skin and you can see here in my color here, the foreground color now changes from black to the color that I've picked. I now am telling Photoshop that wherever I paint will be the color that I've just selected. All right, so that's holding down the Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, one click, and you've got that color selected. And now I've got my flow at 10%, opacity at 100. My blend mode is still normal. I can come in and I'm just brushing over the top of that area. And it's like applying makeup. And you can see that it's just smoothing that out. Now, this can look overdone, but this is really, it's actually a good technique if you're trying to work on maybe proof images that you want to show to your clients, where you might need to do, 50 of these just to show your client proofs, but you don't want them to see their skin all blemished. You can use this technique where they're going to be low res files, and you can just clean the skin tone up a little bit and get rid of any little blemishes. And it's a good sort of in between, and it's also not too bad if you're starting out. And basically you'll see me doing a lot of these in the CCs, so that's exactly what I'm doing. And this is another one when you've got some spare time, get your laptop out or your computer, put your favorite show that you love to binge watch on, and just spend like a half an hour working on a file, and you'll find that you'll quickly get really good at this. All right, so let's have a look. We've got before and after. Now the problem with this is I'm actually applying fresh pixels over the top of an image, and where I've got the image there's actually noise in there, and where I've applied the tone there is a noise. So what I like to do, let me just go back to my history state and just get rid of that last brush. What I like to do is add some noise to the color that I've added to the image, because what that does is it just blends it in a bit better and makes it look a lot more authentic. So it's noise, add noise, and I'm just adding a few pixels. So you can see we've got before and after, but like have a look at that nose area there. That is the original pixels, and here are the ones that I've added with the brush tool. They don't match, but by adding noise, it's looking a lot more similar, and it makes that adjustment that I've done blend in a lot more. So that's a good little trick, and there's quite a few tutorials on doing that. So that's just the final stage there, and that gives you, I didn't do a really good job down here, but you can get the gist of it there on how to retouch an image using the clone tool. And that, I think, is a pretty good introduction to starting out in Photoshop. I'm just going to fix up this side of the face here so it blends in a bit more, because I don't really like that line there. All right, and now it's at 100%. I'm going to knock that back to about 50%. So I just want to take the edge off, but I still want it to look natural, so we can see before and after, and that's just cleaned up the skin. Now there's more we can do to that, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what's possible in Photoshop. So now that when you watch the more advanced tutorials, or when you're watching the CCs, you'll have a better idea of how it all works. Okay, so I've done all the adjustments there. I've got the makeup applied. I've got the blemishes removed there. The next thing I do is if I'm happy with that, and there's probably a couple more things that you can do to this image in Photoshop, but most of these you can also do in Lightroom. So once I'm happy with how that looks, all I need to do is go down to File, Save, and you'll see the progress bar there at the bottom. All right. Okay, once you see that that's gone and the image is saved, if I now open Lightroom, you will see that that image that I have now edited appears next to the original in Lightroom. So it's stored back in Lightroom. So here is the image that I edited, and I'll just zoom in so you can see the face. All right, so there's the image that I edited, and here's the one before in Lightroom. Just zoom in. We'll just go to... All right. Before and after. Before and after, and it's all stored in one place in Lightroom. And if you want to now, you can continue to work on this image in Lightroom. So that is a really cool way to sort of get your feet, dip your feet into the Photoshop app and have a play around. Don't be overwhelmed. Just start slowly and build up. And this, I think, this is a really good way to start with Photoshop and go from there. Peeling potatoes, and we work our way up to making the filet mignon.